everybody, and welcome to another episode of But Is It Gothic? I'm Lauren, and this is Mary, and we are the Ghoul Guides. So today in But Is It Gothic, I will be arguing a case to Mary that I know is one that I want to say disagree on, but I know that it's something that I am a lot more passionate about than you are.
I think, yeah. So I think with what you're going to argue, it's not necessarily that we're going to disagree per se. And I'm sure, I'm very easily swayed when it comes to, making the case that things are Gothic. It's just more that I'm not a massive fan of this thing. So I'll leave it there. But I'm ready for you to convince me.
Yeah, I think that I have a good argument, and I think that you will agree with me, but I know that, and that's kind of why I wanted to pick this one, because I know that it's something that we certainly haven't talked about really together.
But I'm definitely I'm definitely of the opinion that you don't have to like everything, and that's fine. And just because I don't like something doesn't mean that it's bad. Exactly. And also, just because I don't like something doesn't mean that it's not Gothic. So
okay, so today, the case that I will be presenting is for the Disney Princess franchise. Okay, so just to clarify for those of you like Mary who maybe don't know what the Disney princesses are. So in 2000, Disney essentially sat down and were like, hey, we have all of these princesses, and basically the new kind of director of Disney was like, I keep seeing girls turning up to Disney events, so like Disney on Ice, Disney shows, Disney parades, in knockoff Disney princess outfits. So there's all these little girls who want to be Belle, Ariel, Cinderella, Mulan, and we're not really doing anything to capitalize on that. And we're Disney. And our thing is that we capitalize. And I say this as a Disney fan.
Capitalist vampires.
They
exist everywhere.
They are an extremely capitalist company. There is no two ways about it. So they decided to make the Disney princesses a line. So originally, all of Disney was kind of split into their properties. So Aladdin was its own property, Cinderella was its own property, Beauty and the Beast was its own property, The Little Mermaid was its own property. And each movie had shows, it had sections in the Disney theme parks, it had merchandise, it had books, and they were like, okay, well, lots of kids like more than one Disney princess, so they decided to make the Disney princesses a thing. So in 2000, Disney princesses became a line, and it became a Disney thing. So the Disney princesses have kind of evolved and expanded over the time. So originally Tinkerbell was a Disney princess, and then they were like,
she's a fairy.
Tinkerbell is clearly not a princess and is in fact a fairy. However, you do have people in there like Mulan, who is not a princess but is a badass warrior. So I accept Mulan's inclusion because I personally love Mulan. So originally the Disney princesses were your classic kind of iconic Disney princesses from Disney's very earliest. So Snow White, the first Disney princess, you had Aurora from Sleeping Beauty, Ariel from The Little Mermaid, Cinderella from Cinderella, Jasmine from the Aladdin series, you had Mulan, Belle from Beauty and the Beast, and they were your Disney princesses. And then as Disney have released more films, so now Rapunzel from Tangled is in the Disney princess line, as is Merida from Brave, who is, the badass Disney princess whose story doesn't end with a marriage because feminism. And Tiana from Princess and the Frog, who was badass businesswoman. And then more recently, you have people like Anna and Elsa from the Frozen movies. So it's essentially an opportunity for Disney to capitalize on some of their most popular properties.
And I can remember these from Wreck-It Ralph 2.
Yes, Wreck-It Ralph 2. The princesses are in Wreck-It Ralph 2.
The princesses are in there, yeah. And I can't remember the racer girl's name, but
Penelope.
Vanellope, there we go.
Who is in fact a Disney princess.
Yeah. So that's
yeah.
That's
So essentially, it's a really smart idea from Disney, because anytime Disney release a new princess, which, you know, that's one of their things, like that's the type of story that they tell, they reimagine fairy tales, they can add that princess to the Disney princess line. So when Disney bought Star Wars about 10 years ago now, there was lots of jokes about Princess Leia becoming a Disney princess. And Disney haven't put her into the Disney princess line, but they have capitalized on merchandising, which I'm okay with, because there was no Princess Leia merchandise when I was a kid, and now there's loads, and I get to relive my childhood.
And can on that kind of merchandise jokes about Disney princesses, when the MCU was bought by Disney, suddenly all of these like superheroes were like, oh, I guess I'm also a Disney princess too.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, big up all the Captain Marvel merchandise. So yeah, for those of you that aren't aware of the Disney princess line, it is essentially bringing together some of Disney's best loved properties. So this means that, and it's quite an interesting thing on like a sort of like metatextual level, because the princesses don't exist in tandem necessarily. So it's kind of interesting when you think of it about a property that is essentially marketed to children, because the princesses don't, up until Wreck-It Ralph 2, really, the princesses don't really exist together. There's no sort of like Disney princess show where, you know, they all like hang out in a castle. But there's lots of toys and there's lots of merchandise. So it's a kind of allowing children to have that imaginative kind of quality and prospect themselves. So you can buy a set where you've got Belle, Ariel, and Cinderella. You can have a t-shirt that's got all of the Disney princesses on them. You can buy a coloring book and it's all the Disney princesses hanging out together. So, but there isn't, you know, a Disney princess movie. So it kind of allows Disney to keep these properties separate and to make a new Little Mermaid, a new, you know, Beauty and the Beast book. It allows them to still separate these properties and have their original stories and their canon, but to then, for the purposes of selling shit to small children and adults who use their hard-earned money to buy things that are intended for small children, such as myself,
no judgment here. No judgment here.
I freaking love the Disney princesses, y'all. So that's what the Disney princesses are. So where do the Disney princesses come from? So the Disney princesses, like many of Disney's properties, are drawn from largely fairy tale and folklore. So Disney as a property is kind of split into, or originally was kind of split into two strands. You had Mickey Mouse and the sort of Mouse House, Disney own brand. And then you had the fairy tale. So the fairy tale line of Disney kind of starts with Snow White, but they do lots of other, you know, you have particularly between like the 50s and the early 90s, lots of Disney short films that play with folklore, fairy tale, nursery rhymes, fables, all that kind of thing. But the Disney princess films are kind of the most famous ones. So these are all being drawn on stories that we all know. And from a capitalist perspective, this is really smart because these are all stories that enable Disney to trademark them. So Disney creates their Little Mermaid and Ariel is their trademarkable property, which is very, very smart of them. But what's important here, and I think what's important when we're talking about this as a potential Gothic property, is to recognize that these are stories that almost every nation around the world has some version of. So Cinderella and Snow White, for example, are two of the most famous fairy tales. These are fairy tales that exist in some way in almost every culture in the world. And I'm not going to go into the way that we categorize fairy tales, because it's a very complex system developed by scholars that kind of identify certain properties, and they use this to sort of almost catalogue them. So there's almost like a library, like a Dewey Decimal System for fairy tales. And this is the way that scholars have kind of tracked the progression of these stories and how they evolve and adapt to the different cultures that they're in. But what's really key here, and I guess what's really most important, is that almost everybody is familiar with these stories.
So even I, who have seen very few Disney films, know what you're talking about.
Exactly.
Know the stories, know the characters.
You know, there are versions of these tales in South America, in Asia, in Europe, in Africa, in Australasia, that all are slightly different, but all have very similar properties, because ultimately fairy tales come from the oral tradition. Now, the oral tradition essentially is the beginning of all human knowledge, history, and storytelling. You know, we know that humans began telling stories to pass down knowledge, and that's how religion and folklore and myth began. That doesn't make it necessarily Gothic in of itself, but when we think of things like Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, what we recognise is that from the very beginning of the Gothic genre, you have a tradition of a text that is not your own being told to you and written down. So from the very beginnings of the Gothic novel, you have a monk, for example. You get this in Castle of Otranto, you get this in A Sicilian Romance by Radcliffe. Later on, you get this, for example, in Frankenstein. Frankenstein is telling Walton his story. You get this in Confessions of a Justified Sinner. The person whose story this is actually telling it to the person who is transcribing, or has told it to someone, and they are now telling to someone else who is transcribing it. So the Gothic has always kind of embodied this idea of a tale being passed down. So the connection between the fairy tale and the folklore tradition and the Gothic tradition is very close, because the Gothic works in analogy. You know, we tell Gothic stories because we have anxieties about our present and we use the past to tell them. We tell fairy tales because they pass down morals and knowledge and, you know, tips. Don't go into the woods at dark, don't eat the food, don't step inside the fairy circle. So we pass down that kind of knowledge. So Disney is drawing on something that is much, much older, much, much broader, and it's kind of distilling it into a recognizable trademarkable property. So Disney aren't the first company or creative to do this. And actually the stories that they're mostly drawing on are by the likes of the Brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen. Their stories are quite different from those. Disney's Little Mermaid versus Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid, two very different stories. Disney go for the far less tragic option. You know, these are stories intended to, you know, bring a certain amount of joy.
Which has always been partly my issue with them, is because I love fairy tales and I love that kind of oral tradition and tracing that through, and I think some of them are really interesting, and especially the Brothers Grimm, which are distinct, like you say, they're a distinct tradition, and there are many other traditions. I just think it's like Disney, for me, just like takes the teeth out of them.
It does definitely, and that weirdly is why I like it, because I find them very comforting. So I love Brothers Grimm. I have a really great copy of the Brothers Grimm fairy tales that's illustrated by Mervyn Peake.
Of course you have that.
Of course. But I love Disney because I find it very comforting. It's nice, you know, it's nice to think that you can live happily ever after, even if I don't really believe in it. It's nice to tell myself a lie for 90 minutes in bright animated Technicolor.
And sometimes we all need that, you know, which I think is fine. And you're going to now tell me that this is something Gothic, right?
So I am going to shatter that illusion. So Disney are drawing on the tales of the likes of Brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen. So they are generally picking up on very specifically European and kind of Mid and Eastern European folklore and fairy tale. So we've kind of ascertained that fairy tales are, by their very nature, an oral tradition of storytelling. And that oral tradition of storytelling relies very heavily on the supernatural. To be able to tell the story and to have, you know, to have it have its weight, to have it have its you know, its power, its didacticism, because that is essentially what it is. This is a didactic principle. I will tell you this story and you will learn. And as you grow older, you will realize that I'm not telling you a story about Baba Yaga and her house with its chicken legs as the reason that you shouldn't go into the woods at night. What I'm actually telling you is that there are very real dangers of why you shouldn't do these things and why you should be careful of these things, because the world is a dark and terrible place. But as a child, this is what you need. And as an adult, you come to see the reason that I told you this story. The supernatural is absolutely crucial to this. So as I mentioned just before, this is where we get our first biggest link. The supernatural as a didactic power. This is what a lot of the Gothic is about. And even when you're getting the explained supernatural as a didactic power, like in Radcliffe, in which the lesson is don't believe in ghosts and ghouls, because real men will do far more terrible things to you than any supernatural power could ever do to you. You're still using the supernatural as a didactic tool. You're still using it as an educational facility to pass on some kind of old learned knowledge to try and protect a younger generation.
Yeah, it's like you say, it's inherently moralistic.
Exactly.
And there's a moral, and the target audience, for example, with Radcliffe, women. It's like,
exactly,
don't believe ghost stories, but the real threat out there are often men.
And whilst it would be incredibly reductive and incredibly regressive to suggest that Disney is only for girls, because the gender binary is bullshit, Disney, particularly in the 90s, was heavily marketed towards young women. And there is that kind of misconception that it's marketed to young girls because it's promoting a very rigid set of female ideals. And I feel like you start to get this connection between things like Radcliffe and the Disney princess. But if you think about that use of the supernatural, there's a really important, almost feminist history happening here, in which the supernatural is used to protect young women. It's used as a way to pass that knowledge on safely. So, for me as a young woman, and I think for many young women, when you watch Disney and Maleficent in Sleeping Beauty turns into a dragon, you're not really being warned that if you're not a super good girl and you don't follow the rules, a dragon is gonna, attack you or put you to sleep with a spinning wheel. You're learning about something bigger, something kind of more intricate than that. When you're 5, you're afraid of a dragon, but that stays with you. You remember that dragon, you remember that story. So this is where I think you start to get, and this is why I think the existence of a Disney princess line is an incredibly Gothic thing, because what you've done is collected together a set of stories that use the supernatural, the unnatural, that use the transgressive, the subversive, to create a catalogue of texts that specifically exist for the purpose of educating and protecting young women. Or young people, but the way that it's marketed, we're kind of considering this, and this is a much larger issue. And hopefully at some point we'll get to talk about this. But I think that in itself, the creation of a set of texts that is explicitly coded as feminine, is explicitly coded as, female didacticism, and then uses these really kind of heavily supernatural, heavily transgressive elements to kind of pass this message on, is super Gothic. We don't really have, when you're a kid, you get given a collection of the 7 best fantasy novels for young children, or you get given a collection of kind of fables and things like that. That's essentially what the Disney princesses are. So I think that in of itself, the creation of them as a line and as a text is very Gothic in itself, because basically what you're doing is creating a canon, creating a set, creating a curriculum that is using things like the supernatural, things like oral history, things like inherited, it's like inherited memory, inherited knowledge, to essentially protect. And there is a moralistic element. I'm not saying that Disney is not without its incredibly conservative morals, but you don't have to read them that way. And it's the same as conservative.
We can look at we can look at Disney through the lens of the death of the author and look at them as texts and think about them as texts that have created something in and of themselves that's also haunted by the other kinds of fairy tales and oral traditions that have come before them. Is this your next point? Okay.
So my next point, and this is kind of my bridge point, is that by creating Disney princesses as a line, what's essentially happened is it's fit in with the rest of the fairy tales. So fairy tales kind of almost exist in movements. You have like the Brothers Grimm version of the fairy tale, the Hans Christian Andersen version of the fairy tale, then you have the Victorian versions of the fairy tale, and then you have, you know, the early 20th century versions of the fairy tales. Then you have all of those creepy budget animations from the 90s that scared the living daylights out of me as a small child. So this is not the only version of this story that a child is likely to be exposed to. And what's really fascinating is, in the same way that the Gothic plot is constantly reimagined, and that you get the same plot imagined in multiple different versions, by creating the Disney princess as an identifiable line, as a brand, it's essentially leaning into that. This is not the only version of this story. There are all these other versions of this story. And so if you've got 6 versions of Cinderella, you're able to then draw the lines from each version and take from that what you will. Well, I think that as well, probably an unintentional aspect, but if we think about it from like a death of the author perspective and a postmodern perspective, a really interesting phenomenon arises in which you become aware that this is not the canon version. You know that this isn't, by 10, this is unlikely to be the only Cinderella that you've seen. You've probably seen 8 other Cinderellas or read 8 other Cinderellas. So you know the differences in the story, and you know the different versions, and you're able to pick out the similarities and the differences, which means that Cinderella will mean something slightly different for each person that comes across it. In the same way that, you had all the imitators of Radcliffe and all the reimaginings of the Radcliffe plot, from people who were literally just ripping it off for a quick book, to people like Roche who were inspired by it and involved upon it, to people like Lewis who were like, I'm going to make this way darker and way more dirty, to which Radcliffe responded. I think with Disney, by saying, this is a line, we've created an identifiable brand, we're calling it the Disney Princesses, you've essentially created another Brothers Grimm catalogue of fairy tales.
What this has reminded me of is the kind of Gothic monsters.
Yes.
So obviously everyone knows Frankenstein's creature. There's, werewolves, Dracula, vampires, all of these specific kind of creatures that do come from text, but are also based on, folklore and oral traditions before then. But then, especially with the advent of film, I'm thinking particularly of Universal, the Universal monster movies.
Hammer horror morris.
And then the Hammer horror, they're distinct. And I think, the I don't know how successful it will be, but the current Universal trend to redo all of those Universal monster movies as a kind of, like you're saying, as a canon, but these are distinct Universal ones. Obviously they exist outside, and you might know Dracula or the Wolfman or Frankenstein's creation from other things.
And you only have to look at something like Frankenstein. The Universal and Hammer horror Frankenstein, then, and same with Dracula, gives life to its own version of Frankenstein and Dracula, and that then becomes the popular culture version of Frankenstein and Dracula. By making Disney princesses, so think about times, there's always been reimaginings and dark reimaginings of the Disney-fied version of these fairy tales. Disney princesses as a line are conceived in 2000. If we think about post-millennial Gothic, which is a term coined by Catherine Spooner, excellent book if you haven't read it, where she thinks about, the post kind of 2010, in particular, but post-millennial as a broader concept, the post-millennial Gothic. So Disney princesses come in 2000. Within that trend within the last 20 years of post-millennial Gothic, we've got an increasing number of fairy tale retellings that aren't subversive, because the original fairy tales are incredibly dark. but they're reacting to the Disney. So it's not like people aren't aware of the fact that the Brothers Grimm and the much older version of these fairy tales don't exist. But the popularization of the Disney princess and the commodification of the Disney princess has now led to a massive trend of subverting the Disneyfication of the princess figure. So that, again, in of itself, by creating this as, you know, it's not just Disney do this thing, by Disney saying, this is our brand, we are trademarking this, we have made this canon, that this is, you know, something identifiable, something commodifiable. It allows people to then work with it, around it, and against it. And I think that, so that's kind of my first part of this argument, is that the existence of Disney princesses, of Disney saying this is a thing, so not just Disney making their own version of Snow White, that by saying these are the Disney princesses, we've trademarked them, we're going to brand them, we're going to make materials based on them, that in itself was incredibly Gothic and has spawned a lot of Gothic texts from it, because you now have a lot of writers who were young teenagers in the 2000s who associate Cinderella not necessarily with the Brothers Grimm, but with Disney. So that, I think, is like, I would say that this argument is kind of split into two halves, in that the existence of a thing called the Disney princesses, TM, is incredibly Gothic in of itself. And that is kind of why it's, one, a Gothic monstrous creation of itself, and two, as all great Gothic texts do, has inspired a new, within the post-colonial Gothic, has inspired this new line of Gothic creation. And I think that's really fantastic. The second part of my argument, and this is the bit that anyone who's ever heard me talk about Romance of the Forest might already be aware of this. Okay, so the Disney princess films use a number of what we would identify as fairy tale tropes. And for the purpose of this, I'm mostly going to be talking about Sleeping Beauty, because Sleeping Beauty as a Disney film is a turning point for Disney. Many people split the Disney films into sort of Golden Age, Silver Age, Revival, you know, and depending on who you talk to, depending on which age they prefer, they have slightly different kind of time frames. But you have the early Disney classics, things like Cinderella and Snow White. Then you have, you know, there's a sort of dip for a while. And then you have the revival period, which is when you have things like Aladdin, Hercules, The Little Mermaid, so that kind of early 90s. But Sleeping Beauty is a really important one because of the way that it's animated, the success that it had, and the way that it then became an icon of Disney. So Sleeping Beauty's castle is Disney. You know, when people think of Disney and they think of the Disney logo, they think of that castle. And that castle has now become, you know, Cinderella's castle, Prince Eric's castle, and The Little Mermaid. But Sleeping Beauty as a property has become very, very closely linked with Disney. And it's one of their really formulative properties.
And castles are so iconic.
Yes.
Because they're Gothic.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So Sleeping Beauty is a really interesting one because it is incredibly popular. It's a very, very, very popular film, and it's a very popular property, and it remains very popular, which is fascinating because it's one of the only ones not to have had spin-offs. So most of the Disney properties have enjoyed spin-offs, particularly the ones that were released in the 90s. So Little Mermaid, Aladdin, Hercules all had television series. But things like Snow White, there's been spin-off properties about the dwarves. Beauty and the Beast had spin-off properties. Cinderella and Snow White have both had spin-off properties. Sleeping Beauty has remained pretty much untouched, kind of as it is. They haven't added that much extra to it. There are, you know, books for kids and things like that, but it's a really interesting one from that perspective. But Sleeping Beauty is going to be my case study because it is the most obviously fairy tale one. So Sleeping Beauty is presented as a fairy tale, but it's also presented as medieval romance. So Sleeping Beauty begins with a book and it says, "Once upon a dream," which is the song from Sleeping Beauty. The book opens and it's this beautifully illustrated medieval style manuscript text. And you have the story begins to tell and the page essentially comes alive. So the animation style used is based on medieval, and it's a very simplified version, but one thing that Disney are very good at doing is tailoring their animation style for the product that they're presenting. So Sleeping Beauty is presented as a European medieval fantasy, or a chivalric romance.
I knew you were going to say it.
What uses chivalric romances as its basis? Gothic novels. So while Sleeping Beauty is using seemingly fairy tale conventions, I would argue that it's more consciously relating itself to the 18th century Gothic. And there's a couple of reasons that I argue this, and that is because the whole story is set in a sort of ambiguous European medieval style. So rather than being fairy tale, it becomes romance of chivalry. And the reason that I say this is because of the way that the story plays out. You have the young princess, Aurora, who upon her birth is cursed. The procession that begins the film is straight out of a Gothic novel. You have this, wonderful procession. The king and queen have finally had this baby. It's all very hyper stylized. You have this song, and then all of a sudden the music changes, the scenery changes, the color changes, and Maleficent, the evil fairy, appears. As everyone knows, curses the baby to prick her finger on the spinning wheel when she turns 16 and fall asleep. Aurora is then taken into the forest. She becomes Briar Rose, and she's raised by the three fairies. So at this point, Disney is melding a number of versions of this fairy tale together. The Briar Rose fairy tale and the Sleeping Beauty fairy tale are not necessarily the same fairy tale. In the same versions, in the same way that the Snow White Disney version blends a number of versions of the Snow White myth, Disney are blending myths and fairy tales here.
It reminds me of the way that Gothic texts use not only those kinds of chivalric texts, but also just religious kind of narratives and structures. And it's just like, well, I need this for my narrative, so I'm going to take this, and I'm going to take this. And it's just, it's just going to be its own thing.
So in the Disney version, we have Briar Rose, Aurora, raised for 16 years in, ding, 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 rural idyll. Where are all the best Gothic heroines raised?
Of course.
Rural idylls. So this is linking her to the Radcliffean Gothic. And when I say Radcliffean, again, I'm not talking about just Radcliffe's novels. I'm talking about the Gothic novels that work within that tradition that Radcliffe popularized. And, Smith and Reeve are doing it before her, but it's Radcliffe that kind of makes it a convention. So she is very much like Madeleine Clairmont. She is very much like Emily St. She lives this, peaceful life with these three fairies who are hilarious, can't bake a cake without using magic. So, she's kind of, and the thing is about Aurora, again, and this is where this is a classic fairy tale trope, but this is why I think they are playing into the Gothic more consciously, is Aurora is a good girl. Aurora is a good daughter. She's, honest with her pseudo mothers. She understands their protectiveness of her. She loves them, but she wants to know more. She's very curious. And this is a trait of the Disney princess because it comes from fairy tale. But Aurora, she goes off into the forest every day and she picks berries and she talks to her friends in the forest. And on one particular day, she's singing a song about how she hopes to meet a boy that she's dreamt about. And she's dancing around with her owl friends.
As
you do, the boy appears and begins singing with her. Now, this is literally a scene from Romance of the Forest.
Yep.
When Radcliffe's 1791 novel, Romance of the Forest, the heroine Adeline, who is very similar to Aurora in terms of the way in which she's presented. Now, I'm not saying that they had necessarily read Romance of the Forest, but maybe I'm saying that because Adeline is in France, so Europe. She is fleeing. She's been taken from a convent And her father is like, if you don't go back, you're gonna die. We're gonna kill you. And this guy Lamont, who is fleeing Paris because he's done some bad shit, sees her and is so overcome by her innocence, her sereneness, her beauty, that he, even though he's a coward, he's like, I have to protect this girl. She's clearly innocent. And they start living in this abbey, this ruined abbey in the middle of the woods. Adeline...
I would go to hide out, not gonna lie.
Adeline's pretty happy there, and one day she walks out and she sat by a little lake with her fawn. She has a fawn that follows her around, and she starts singing. And as she's singing, a young man in hunter's dress appears out of the woods and begins singing with her. Now, Adeline is aware of the fact that if anyone finds out that they're there, they're going to be in trouble. But because this boy, this man in hunter's garb, seems to be such a kindred spirit, and he sings so beautifully, and the animals aren't afraid of him, Adeline does eventually run away from him, but trusts him, and is kind of like in love with, it's like love at first sight. This is literally what happens in Sleeping Beauty. Aurora is in the woods, she's singing with her little friends, and Prince Philip, who is the best Disney prince, fight me internet, is on his horse, and him and his horse hear this singing, and he's like, lad, gonna find out what this singing comes from. And he sees her and he's like, wow. So he starts singing along with her, and they sing Once Upon a Dream together, and they dance together, and he's like, I think I love you. And she's like, I think I love you too. And then she's like, shit, I've got to go home. And he runs off, and he's like, and the joke is that he doesn't want to marry this girl who his dad has told him he's going to marry, and the joke is that he doesn't know that the girl is actually Aurora. But that scene, that formative scene, which is really the most screen time Aurora gets on her own, is exactly the same as the scene from Romance in the Forest. So here Disney is not just using fairy tale tropes by using the tradition of the chivalric romance. This isn't the only film that does this, it's just the one that does it most obviously. And the supernatural threats. Disney is directly playing into the Gothic tradition. And of course what happens is Aurora is, and this makes me think of Emily in Melmoth, Aurora is taken back to her parents, the king and queen. She at that time doesn't want to go because she loves her life in the forest. She wants to stay with the fairies, and she wants to marry this boy she's just met, who she doesn't know is her actual betrothed, Prince Philip. She gets to the castle, and it's kind of implied that the reason that she's tempted by Maleficent's spell is less because she's weak-minded or because she, she's too much has been kept from her. They haven't told her the truth. It's not. So you have that again. Aurora isn't a weak-willed girl. She isn't manipulated by the evil fairy. She's very much a Gothic heroine who is battling the things that people won't tell her to try and have her own agency. But then what happens is she falls asleep, and who has to save her but Prince Philip and the fairies? So the way that Disney presents this, the castle with thorns, the Maleficent turning into a dragon, this is all drawing on fairy tales much, much older than the Gothic, much older than the Brothers Grimm tales. But the way that plays out, because the whole film is presented as a chivalric romance, and you have the prince having to fight his way through, blessed by the fairies, to get to the dragon, and the way that, it's very Gothic aesthetically, and that is my other point, which kind of almost doesn't need making, is that the Gothic aesthetic is heavy in Disney. You have...
It looks spooky, it's dark, you've got all of the colour palettes.
And some of them are terrifying. Have you seen The Witch and Snow White? I still am afraid of that now. Like, never mind as a child. When my sister and I went to Disneyland, in our 20s, we were like, haha, let's go on the Snow White ride, that'll be cute. I screamed more because you turn around and the creepy tree turns into the witch. I screamed more on a ride intended for 5-year-olds than I did on the actual roller coaster that's meant to be a thrill ride.
And what is that? What's that early Gothic, the early Disney film? Was it Phantasmagoria or
Fantasia?
Fantasia. There we go. Yeah, that.
Fantasia is
incredibly
Gothic.
Some of those short films are just so creepy and spooky.
Super creepy.
Yeah.
So the Gothic aesthetic thing kind of goes without saying. You have villains like Jafar and Ursula who are other, who are, coded in a certain way, who
the witch from the Seven Dwarfs, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
So the evil stepmother in Snow White.
That evil stepmother, the old kind of
the crone.
That she is inherently so anti-Semitic.
Yes,
she is exactly so many Gothic texts use those kinds of racial othering to draw on. And
you get the same thing in Aladdin. Jafar is the only character who is made explicitly, racially other. Jasmine and Aladdin are kind of passing. Disney do this. They draw on a lot of these really quite unhealthy Gothic tropes, but they also do them in a way, you have lots of green smoke, you have lots of purple, you have lots of black, you have lots of kind of Maleficent in particular. She is unnaturally tall. Maleficent is shaped differently to any of the other characters in that film. And when you think about the way that Radcliffe decides some of her villains, and that when you get to the more supernatural Gothic in the early 19th century, Dracula is, late 19th century, but Dracula and Camilla, are both unnaturally shaped. You have a lot of this they're strangely angular, or they're oddly tall or oddly short, or they
that exaggeration that often does fall into a weird campness, but it is just like you say, that exaggerated performance.
And Maleficent, the music, the way that Maleficent's done in the Sleeping Beauty movie is fantastic. She is genuinely, I think, one of the best villains, because she's this woman that commands this army of goblins, and she is extremely powerful, and she's very regal. She's not an easily taunted villain. She's quite terrifying, and that without the fairies, Philip is not able to defeat her. But that narrative of the prince having to come and save, yes, that's classic fairy tale. But if you think about the chivalric romance and the way that this film is presenting itself as a medieval text, it's playing directly into that Gothicization, because this is a film. This is not a medieval romance. It's not told like a medieval romance. So it's essentially a Gothic text, because it's doing what Reeve and Walpole and Radcliffe are doing in the late 18th century. It's taking a 12th or 13th century idea and it's retelling it for a contemporary audience. So, one, Disney is often terrifying. Disney uses Gothic aesthetics very liberally to make its villains, because they're films for children. So you need to have that key coding. So the Gothic is present because your villains, you only have to look at the crone from Snow White, Ursula from The Little Mermaid. The exception, I guess, is something like Beauty and the Beast, where you have, but then even there, Beauty and the Beast, the villain is the ignorant villagers who are afraid of the supernatural other.
It's incredibly Radcliffean in that actually the villain turns out to be the kind of rich, wealthy wife.
Yeah, incredibly Radcliffean. But also, I think what's really fascinating is that when you look at Sleeping Beauty, you're not just seeing the Gothic as it's been connected and entwined with fairy tales into the 20th and 21st century. You're seeing actual tropes, not from fairy tales, but from medieval romances as reimagined by Gothic tales, used in these Disney films. So, I posit that the Disney princess line is Gothic.
Okay. So before we rule, let's try and sum up. So we have you kind of the first part of your argument, which is about the taking the oral traditions, retelling them, and that kind of textuality and metatextuality that's creating the actual kind of stories and the narratives that are therefore haunted by the previous versions. And then, as you say, the creation of a canon of figures that are distinct, and like you say, like resemble the Gothic monsters and that kind of capitalist production of them. That, you know, let's just say it's inherently vampiric, because it is. And then you have your kind of case study, which you were talking about Sleeping Beauty, but I guess you can talk about so many others, as you have said.
Like
the aesthetics of Sleeping Beauty is so Gothic, spooky, dark colours, the castle, they
literally ripped a scene straight from the Radcliffe novel.
I mean,
they literally took the scene straight from the Radcliffe novel.
I mean, that is
Girl singing with forest animals by pool, joined by man. Because in Radcliffe, she's like, "Oh yeah, young man in hunter's garb." Prince Philip appears in the forest in what is very clearly hunter's garb. He's not dressed as a prince. He's dressed as a hunter because he's out hunting.
So I mean, you know, that is, I think you can exactly say that those scenes are so intertwined, and it would be really fascinating to see if anyone involved in the creation of that film had previously read Radcliffe. I think that would be so fascinating.
I would love to know, because they're so, like, I would confidently put money on there being some connection, whether or not they'd read it or whether or not they'd been exposed to it, because they're so incredibly similar. And even down to like the characterization similarities between Adeline and Aurora, between Philip and Theodore, because the important thing about Romance of the Forest is that Theodore is the good hero. You know, he's the only Radcliffean hero really who's that fully developed, because the two prior novels aren't as